Welcome to a quiet journey through a tale of strength found not in conquest, but in the courage to choose a different path.
It was supposed to be a day of triumph. The sun rose over the valley as it always did, casting light on thousands of polished helmets, gleaming spears, and rippling banners arranged in neat, terrifying silence. Birds fled the trees in waves, perhaps sensing what men did not, that in this field, beneath the sky, something irreversible would unfold. It would not be in the clang of steel, but in the quiet between orders, not in the shouting of victors, but in the breath a man draws before he chooses to lose. And in that silence, a man stood at the crest of the hill, alone and still, watching the army he had spent 20 years building, drilling, and bleeding for, breathing like one living beast before him. He had only to give the signal, but he didn't. He simply stood. In that single, profound refusal, General Lucian Quintus became something else entirely. Neither a coward nor a traitor, but a silent question.
He had been born in the midst of rain, the kind that blurred village boundaries and made kings and commoners alike retreat to their hearths. A shepherd's son, they said, though no one knew for certain, for he had been found in the ruins of a barn, wrapped in a wool cloak too fine for any nearby peasant to own, and branded with a mark not of this kingdom, but another. He should have died, as most foundlings did, but something about the way he clenched his fists even as an infant, something about the rage in that newborn cry, made the midwife hesitate. Leave him, one had said. He's cursed. But she didn't. She carried him home and raised him as her own. He never knew her name, as she died before he could speak, but her handprint, calloused and steady, remained with him always.
By 13, Lucian had broken the arm of a tax collector who tried to take their winter grain. By 15, he had joined a mercenary camp, untrained, unwashed, and unnoticed, until he wrestled a grown man off a horse with nothing but a shovel handle. By 17, he commanded the night patrols, and by 20, he led them all. He fought in silence, issuing orders like iron chiseled into flesh. He did not joke, did not drink, did not chase women or dice. The men under him called him the Ghost, not because he disappeared, but because death followed wherever he went. He rose not by charm, but by consequence. Those who questioned him either vanished or returned altered, and none defied him twice.
And yet, despite the blood and the victories, he did not ascend to power by crushing enemies. He ascended because he understood something most generals forgot: how not to win. It was during the siege of Norel, a city carved into cliffs, known for its impregnable walls and ruthless governors. The kingdom needed Norel not for territory, but for message, as taking it meant unification, fear, and obedience. Every general before him had failed, but Lucian didn't. He didn't fight at all. Instead, he waited 111 days. He poisoned the wells with honey and rosemary, not to kill, but to rot the water just enough that it smelled of sweetness and death. He bribed the falconers to send diseased pigeons into their towers, and he let the enemy sleep, then disrupted their dreams with drums played under water, so the vibrations would crawl into their bones. By day 100, the city wasn't under siege. It was hallucinating. By day 111, they opened the gates, begging for slaughter, and he offered bread instead. The king called it genius, the priests called it mercy, but Lucian knew better, for it was neither. It was simply quiet war. His legend grew, and so did the empire, and with it came the things empires always bring: parades, poets, enemies, and betrayals. Lucian never married. The general is already wed to consequence, one senator joked. He had no friends but one, a scribe, young and limping from a childhood fever, whose name was Islam. Islam asked too many questions, and Lucian never answered, but he never dismissed him either. Islam followed him for years, recording his orders, tracing his maps, and organizing his silence into legible stories. One night, as Lucian sharpened his blade, Islam asked, "Why do you never celebrate victory?" Lucian paused, then said, "Because winning is just survival wrapped in applause."
And then came Bellavine, the city of bells, a jewel on the coast, rich, radiant, and rebellious. Its people had not paid tribute in 2 years, laughing at royal decrees and declaring themselves sovereign. They built walls and trained militias, and their markets flourished, while the kingdom taxed its poor into famine. The king wanted blood, and he sent Lucian. But Bellavine was not just any city. It was Eilin's birthplace. "You'll burn my mother's house," Eilin whispered. Lucian said nothing. "You'll kill my cousins." Still nothing. "I will not record this campaign." Lucian looked at him long and heavy, then said, "Then who will remember why I stopped?"
The army marched for 29 days, and on the 30th they reached Bellavine's walls. On the 31st the bells rang, not in surrender, but in celebration. Children danced on the towers, old women threw rose petals, and musicians played at the gates. It wasn't a trap, it was faith. They believed, truly believed, that Lucian would not kill those who had never raised a sword, that he was not like the others, that the man who poisoned water with rosemary would not fill streets with fire. He could take the city by noon. He had 3 siege ladders in place. The archers were ready, and the cavalry waited for the signal. All he had to do was nod. Instead, he dismounted, walked alone to the gates, and waited. The commander of Bellavine, an old man with olive skin and no weapon, met him. Lucian said, "Bow, pay tribute, and I'll leave." The man said, "We are not yours to bow." Lucian nodded, then walked away. The army behind him stared, confused. He said, "We return." The generals revolted, calling it treason. But he said nothing. He simply handed over the command baton and walked into the woods alone. That was the last day the kingdom ever saw General Lucian Quintus.
Rumors erupted like plague. He had gone mad, been poisoned by the city's herbs, fallen in love with the Bellavine commander's daughter, or been a spy all along. None were true. What was true was this: he had refused to win, and the kingdom could not forgive him for that. 10 years passed. The kingdom fractured. Bellavine was attacked again, this time by another general. She fell, and thousands died. But her people, in their final hour, sang a song, a wordless hymn, a bell tune, with no lyrics. Some say Lucian heard it. He returned briefly, in disguise, and buried their commander beneath a pine tree. No one saw him, but pine needles were placed on the tomb in the shape of the kingdom's old crest, burned, broken, and upside down. Islam lived longer. He wrote, he taught, but he never published Lucian's story, not until now. What you've just heard, what you've just imagined, is all that remains. No statue, no song, no crown, just a decision made on a hill beneath a rising sun, when a man decided that to win was to lose something even greater, and that silence could be the loudest legacy of all.
The years after Lucian's disappearance turned the empire he once served into something unrecognizable. Without his presence, the balance between ambition and restraint collapsed. Generals once kept in check by Lucian's quiet authority now warred like wild dogs for prominence. Battles weren't fought, they were displayed. Cities weren't claimed, they were erased. No one spoke his name, not because they forgot, but because they remembered too well. To speak of Lucian Quintus was to reopen a wound no victory could cauterize, the possibility that the greatest military mind of a generation had turned his back not in betrayal, but in protest. It was a winter, unlike any other when the empire lost the northern pass. The general who seized it was not an enemy, but a former student of Lucian's, Commander Elric Tea, ruthless, brilliant, but hollow. He had trained under Lucian during the siege of Arnia, studied his maps, and admired his precision, but he never understood the man behind the tactics. And so, when Elric burned the pass, slaughtered the mountain tribes, and built a fortress from the skulls of their chieftains, he called it Lucian's honor. The irony was not lost on those who knew better, especially not on Islam.
Now aged, his voice weakened by time, but still sharp in thought, Islam wrote a letter. To no one, to Lucian. "They burn in your name," he wrote, "but they have forgotten your silence. They remember your victories, but not the nights you walked alone through the tents, memorizing the names of every boy too afraid to sleep. They remember the cities you conquered, but not the children you spared. They call you a ghost," he continued, "but I think you're watching, and I think one day you will answer." He sealed it but never sent it. He burned it and placed the ashes in a jar of rosemary oil.
Far north, across frozen rivers and cracked stone paths, in a village with no name, a man lived in silence. He did not speak. He did not fight. He fixed roofs, gathered herbs, and listened to the wind. His left hand bore a scar in the shape of the old command baton. Children called him Grey. Elders called him the Exile. But none dared ask where he came from. They knew only this: when wolves came near, they never entered the village. When outsiders raised their voices, they fell quiet upon seeing his eyes. And every spring he walked into the woods for 3 days, and no one followed. Until one day a boy did. He was 12, reckless, motherless, with a mouth full of questions and a knife too big for his waist. He didn't speak much, but he followed the silent man into the trees. For hours nothing happened. Then, by a fallen tree, the man stopped. He placed his hands on the bark, whispered something the boy couldn't hear, then drew a blade, not
to fight, but to carve a symbol, an old one, a broken crown, inverted. The boy finally asked, "What does it mean?" The man looked at him, and for the first time in years he spoke. "It means I failed." The boy blinked. "But they said you were a hero." "I was, until I chose to be something else." "What's that?" "A reminder."
The boy grew and the village grew. War, as it always does, came close again, with a new king and a colder heart. Expansion rebranded as salvation. One night, men in red banners came to the edge of the forest. The villagers were no soldiers, but they did not flee because Grey stood at the edge of the village, hands behind his back, eyes calm. And when the soldiers demanded tribute, he offered bread. When they demanded allegiance, he offered silence. When they raised their weapons, he said 3 words: "You are early." Then he whistled, and from the woods came shapes, not soldiers, not warriors, just people. But people trained quietly, patiently, farmers who learned formations, children who learned signals, a village that had become a shadow army, not to conquer, but to survive. They didn't kill, they disarmed. They didn't burn, they rebuilt. And by dawn the Red Baron soldiers were fed, bandaged, and sent away without a single life lost.
The empire heard of it. They called it a miracle. But Islam, before his death, called it something else: the final campaign of General Quintus. It said Lucian died not on a battlefield, but beneath a cedar tree watching the stars. He spoke no last words. He didn't need to, because by then the story was no longer his. It had become the boy's. And the boy would tell it not with banners or drums, but by teaching others the same lesson Lucian had lived: that not every war must end in fire, that not every victory must come with blood, that to refuse to win when the cost is humanity is not weakness, but the last and hardest form of strength.
Even now, in forgotten valleys and ruined libraries, there are maps with no markings. But if you tilt them in the light, press your thumb against the torner, and whisper the word Bellavine, a hidden path appears. It leads not to conquest, but to memory. And at its end, under layers of dust and silence, you might find a phrase etched in old stone. He stood upon the hill and chose to lose, so others might learn how not to die. He did not win. He endured. And that, in the end, is the mark of true victory.
Years passed. The story of the man who refused to win began to rot at the edges, softened by folklore and reshaped by those who needed heroes simple enough to digest. His silence became romanticized, his defiance made ornamental, and his refusal rebranded as hesitation. They called it a beautiful failure, a parable, a curiosity. And that, perhaps, was the greatest violence ever done to Lucian Quintus. They made him poetic, because poetry, unlike history, can be ignored.
The empire kept expanding, as all empires do, until they collapse under the weight of their own story. The new generation of commanders, raised on legends of blood and fire, sought glory in conquest. But they lacked what Lucian had once embodied, the discipline of restraint. They did not pause before killing. They did not listen before attacking. They did not think beyond their own names. And so, when war came,
Not with rebels, not with kings, but with famine, they found themselves unarmed, because famine is not a foe that yields to swords. And in that silence the empire began to wither. Its borders shrank, its cities dimmed, and its generals, drunk on old songs, tried to blame ghosts. One of them, General Myros, spoke before the council and declared, "This rot began the day Quintus walked away, when we let mercy infect discipline, when we let hesitation pose as wisdom." The chamber applauded, but one old voice did not. Islon's granddaughter, a sklaw, quiet and sharp. She stood uninvited, unarmed, unshaken, and said, "No. The rot began the day you taught soldiers to forget the cost of obedience. The day you told children that silence is weakness. The day you erased men like Quintus, not because they failed you, but because they dared prove that violence was not your only language." And then she left. That was the last public debate the council ever permitted.
Meanwhile, in a hidden town near the remains of Bellavine, the boy, now a man, taught others how to survive, not by fighting, but by watching. He never used Lucian's name, but he used his lessons. He taught that war is loud, but peace must be engineered in whispers. He taught that victories are debts, every one, and must be repaid in care, not celebration. And above his door hung a single relic, the cracked wooden baton of command, worn smooth by decades of weather, tied with a red ribbon. Visitors often asked, "Who did that belong to?" He'd smile, shake his head, and say, "To no one. That's why it still matters."
The empire died slowly, not with a bang, but with a forgetting. Cities stopped responding to edicts. Tithes dried up and borders blurred. And in the chaos, smaller nations emerged, not built on conquest, but memory. One such place, unofficial, unnamed, and uncharted, carved a phrase into their stone gate: "Victory is not survival. Memory is not obedience. Silence is not surrender. Here we remember the general who walked away." It became a place for those with no place, deserters, orphans, wanderers, the shamed and the grieving. They arrived not seeking power, but permission to mourn, to rest, to begin again. Centuries later, a traveler, young and limping from an old injury, found that gate. He had no name, just a journal passed down from his grandmother, filled with stories about a man who never finished his war. He sat beneath the arch for 3 days, waiting. No one came. On the 4th day, an old woman approached him. She asked, "What are you waiting for?" He said, a sign that he was real. She chuckled and placed in his hand a small, rusted, circular medallion etched with 2 letters, LQ. He stared. She added, "The sign isn't in metal. It's in what people chose to build after him." He asked, why did he never return to the empire? She looked at him and replied, "Because when you burn down your house, you don't go back to see if the ashes miss you. You plant somewhere else and hope they grow taller."
There's a phrase they whisper now, in places untouched by map-makers. A phrase not taught, but remembered, passed from breath to breath,
like smoke through trees. He chose to lose, and in doing so, he freed the rest of us from having to win. It does not rhyme, it is not carved in stone, but it lingers long after the fire is gone. And if some day you find yourself standing at the edge of a battlefield, unsure whether to charge or to turn away, if the banners fly high and the voices demand vengeance, if the world screams that history only remembers the conqueror, then remember this: there once was a man who stood at the top of a hill with 1,000 swords behind him. He could have crushed the city below. Instead, he chose to kneel, to listen, to leave. And that choice, uncelebrated, unrecorded, and unfinished, is the reason you still have the choice to stand, or to walk away, or to build something better. He is not gone. He is simply ahead of you, waiting.
There is a chapel carved into stone, half collapsed from time and weather, nestled between two hills so nondescript they have no names. No road leads to it, no village claims it, yet every few years a traveller finds it. Inside there is no altar, only a single chair facing nothing, and above it, painted in flaking ochre, are 6 words: "He won nothing, so we could." There is no signature, no emblem, no proof of who wrote it. Some say Lucian himself placed the words there in his last days, when his knees ached and his memory trembled like a candle in the wind. Others believe the words were never painted, that they simply emerged one night when the right kind of silence filled the room. Whatever the truth, no one who sees it forgets, because those 6 words are not a monument to glory. They are a mirror for the listener, for the reader, for anyone who ever stood at a crossroads between power and principle.
Once, long ago, a small kingdom at the empire's border faced annihilation. A warlord demanded their surrender. Their king was dead, their armies scattered, and they had no chance. But one old soldier, long retired, half-blind and nameless to most, stood before the people and said, "Let them take our land, but not our way. We will not fight to win. We will live to remember." And so they fled, not in fear, but in formation. They left their cities not to burn, but to be buried, sealed under stone, hidden from conquerors. Years later, when the warlord returned to finish his conquest, he found nothing but silence. And silence, unlike resistance, cannot be slaughtered. It waits, it echoes, it outlives.
Back in the village where Lucian once grew old, they tell a story to children who ask too many questions. A story about a man who stopped a war by refusing to start one. They speak of a general who taught swordsmen how to plant, who taught orphans how to lead, who taught his enemies to doubt. They say that when he died there was no thunder, no weeping, only birdsong, as if the forest exhaled. And in that exhale something ancient was set free, a truth older than kings, stronger than armies, quieter than memory, that to leave a fight does not mean you have surrendered, but that you are no longer fighting for the same things.
In our world today, where winning is currency and silence is weakness, where history remembers noise louder than grace, it is easy to forget men like Lucian Quintus, because they do not demand remembrance. They do not shout, they do not raise statues or flags. They walk away into the forests of obscurity and let their footsteps become soil so others may grow. You, listener, who have followed this story through the dusk, what now will you do with it? Will you let it fade into entertainment, or will you hold it quietly, like a coal in your palm, not burning, but warming you when choices grow cold? Will you remember that the greatest victories often look like defeats, that power is not proof of right, that sometimes the man who leaves the battlefield alone, uncheered and silent, is the only one who understood the war? They called him a ghost, but ghosts do not fade. They linger, they whisper, they wait, and perhaps Lucian Quintus is still waiting, not to be praised, not to be vindicated, but simply to be understood, not as a warrior, not as a legend, but as a man who, in a world obsessed with triumph, dared to teach us something far more dangerous, that the refusal to win might be the highest victory of all.
May the quiet courage of this story guide you to a restful and peaceful night's sleep.